and welcome to today's edition of IIEA Insights with me, Dan O'Brien. In September, China will mark the 50th anniversary of the death of Mao Zedong. The then most populous country in the world emerged from the totalitarian experiments conducted during his time as leader, both enfeebled and impoverished. But what has happened since to that country over the past half century is arguably the greatest and most rapid transformation of any country in human history. It is now a superpower that can go toe-to-toe with the only other superpower, as was evident when it effectively won a trade confrontation with the US last year. Europe, and specifically the EU, are pushing back against unfair trade practices, which have seen European exports to China fall, while imports from that country rise rapidly. To discuss all aspects of the relationship, we're joined today by Noah Barkin, who's a senior advisor to the Rhodium Group's China practice based in Berlin, Alicia García Herrero, who holds a range of positions, including as chief economist for Asia Pacific at French investment bank NATIXIS, and Declan Kelleher, who was ambassador of Ireland to the People's Republic of China for 9 years from 2004, and he's also a board member here at IIEA. Welcome to you all, and thanks for joining. Alicia, maybe given that you're based in Asia a lot of the time, would you start by giving us your views on the state of the relationship between Europe and China and how it's evolved in recent years?
Well, the relation has been moving like a little bit like a roller coaster, but downwards overall. That is the way I would summarize it. So we have had the 2010s dominated until 2019 by with up and downs still, but by basically cooperation and engagement. And the reason for that was that Europe was then investing heavily, massively in some cases. Germany is the best example, and Noah can tell us more. In China, at a time where China's return on investment was very high. So overall, there was money to be made. The market was, I would argue, more open, not because China was fully open, but because the domestic competition was less, basically. And that gave room to foreign companies to expand in the domestic market, and also obviously to re-export from China. So that was and then from 2019, pre-COVID, I think Europe realized that the relation had turned less positive, that exports were already waning. It's not new, but they plummeted after COVID. But I think that the trend was becoming more clear. China's rivalry towards the West under Xi Jinping started before COVID, and it only accelerated after COVID. So that's the rivalry concept that we added to the cooperation or engagement, and of course the competition coming from that China moving up the ladder and becoming much more of a competitor in export markets to Europe, and at the same time having this infant industry strategy, industrial policy that would eventually kind of substitute, literally, sometimes for good reasons. China had the right company, sometimes without a reason. Think about luxury or even culture or things where I think China's substitution of our exports was simply a question of self-reliance, or if anything, just protectionism. Yeah. So in that regard, I think the relation turned much more negative. And as of now, if we move forward to today, what I said right after COVID can be multiplied by several digits, because by now we have a big deficit. We had Ukraine, and beyond Ukraine, I mean, the China's position in many other conflicts has been quite, I would say, anti-Western. So I think Europe did take note with Ukraine, and probably could take note with many other events that maybe touch Europe less, but they are of the same nature. So in that regard, I think by now it's very hard to move back to where we were in terms of engagement. I know that we have a call for targeted engagement, our green transition, things we need from China. But we also know that everything we need from China, we need it so desperately that China can basically use these strategic dependencies when needed as a weapon. So in that regard, I think our weak position in this relation, increasingly weak over time, makes it even more difficult down the road to have a free engagement. In other words, we may not turn more negative, and we'll see what happens between today and tomorrow, just because we can't, but not because we wouldn't wish to. That's a big difference, and I would finish here.
Great. Listen, in my introduction, I mentioned trade, but of course, there are many, as you mentioned, European companies in China, and they have faced increased competition, arguably more difficult conditions. Are many companies just pulling out of the Chinese market? Have you noticed that? There clearly many companies are reducing their sales and profitability from their foreign direct investment in China. But are you noticing a clear trend in terms of European companies just shutting up shop and leaving China?
So we did a big analysis with all of the surveys up to 2025 included. So we missed the last one, which is slightly more positive from the European Chamber. So we digged all of the data. We even, ran a few regressions exactly to answer that question. What was behind the increasingly negative sentiment? Just to give a sense of dimension, 2025 was the worst sentiment ever of European companies in China. Worse than 2022, for that matter. With a slight improvement, as I said, in 2026. So the main reason was competition. That's it. Now, is that a good reason to leave? And there is a question in the questionnaire, a recent question. It was not there since 2017, but since 2021, something like that, the chamber included a question, which is, do you plan to leave China? And the numbers increased to a third, but when you actually look backwards, did they actually leave? I mean, we can't identify the companies, to be frank, so it's hard to tell. But when you look at how many companies actually left, which doesn't mean they were the ones who responded, okay, just to be clear, it's actually quite limited. And we tried to explain why this was the case if the sentiment was so negative. So we had different types of companies in this policy brief for Bruegel, and I would say that one of the key groups, I will stop here with this group, was basically stuck in China. That's the label we use for those companies, meaning they had invested so much that even if profitability was going south, it still didn't make any sense to leave, and increasingly so because their innovation happens in China, and to some extent even their exports happen from China already. So, how do you leave? Even if you're not very profitable. So I think there's a lot of that for some European companies. The ones leaving, when you look at the names, are generally those who came last and are relatively small. So they don't have that, that background that they have to kind of maintain. So you come late, you leave early. You come early, you don't leave. That's what we found in this paper.
Perfect. Declan, could I ask you a similar sort of question, more from a diplomatic, but also the economic side, as you know a lot about, and anywhere that you differ with Alicia in terms of the characterization of a roller coaster that's ultimately heading downhill?
No, I'd agree with Alicia, and I think the roller coaster has gathered speed over the last few months. Very briefly, the diplomatic relationship between the EU and China, as you know, since 2019 has been conceived in terms of a triptych of partner, competitor, systemic rival. China has never liked the description of systemic rival and sometimes kind of claims that it doesn't exist. The other element, and Alicia also mentioned this, is the primary prism through which the European Union views its diplomatic relationship with China at the moment is the Chinese position on the Russian illegal aggression against Ukraine. And that has been item number one. the Ukraine issue on every EU summit since 2022. I think China accepts that now and is clearly uncomfortable with this as a major complicating factor in the relationship. But to go back to the increasing speed of the roller coaster, obviously, given the trade and global imbalances issue that Alicia referred to, we had last year a kind of a damp squib 50th anniversary summit between the EU and China. More recently, we've had in March a strong Chinese reaction to the new Industrial Accelerator Act, which essentially the Chinese see as fundamentally protectionist and is aimed, among other things, at ensuring that European companies and European supply chains are diversified and are protected. Secondly, China had a similar reaction to the Cybersecurity Act the following month in April, where China warned of reciprocal measures to be taken were the Cybersecurity Act to be enacted. And last month, there was, and I think this is important, there was an unusually strong reaction by China to the investigation by the Commission of an X-ray scanning company called NUCTEC, which under the foreign subsidies regulation. Now, NUCTEC, as everybody knows, supplies X-ray scanners to numerous airports and other facilities through the European Union. And there's a kind of side issue to that too, is that China particularly objected to what it called the extraterritorial jurisdiction being invoked by the European Union. We now have a situation where the US, China, and the EU are all to differing degrees involved in extraterritorial jurisdiction. So we could have some regulatory crossfire, which will complicate the relationship as we go forward. And very briefly, just to bring it to up to the present day, the Commission on the 29th of May had an orientation debate about essentially moving from a piecemeal defensive approach on trade defense to a more systemic security-oriented proactive approach. And this is going to be in some sense discussed at dinner this evening by the heads of government at the European summit. Now, China's not on the agenda, but the discussion is going to be about the question of imbalances and particularly Chinese role in imbalances. And the European Council is not a legislative body. So what one could expect is some kind of orientations from the heads of government the Commission could work on, and the European Council later in the year could come and review those or possibly approve those. Two final points, which I think are important as well. All of this is not taking place against a still life canvas. It's a moving geopolitical picture. And probably the most important element in this is, I think détente would be too strong a word, but the move towards some kind of what the White House and China call constructive strategic stability between China and the United States. And if you do end up with a transactional relationship between China and the US, then that I think is going to cause further challenges for the EU and EU companies. And finally, the EU is doing one thing I think is very important. It's hedging its bets. It's de-risking from both the US and from China. And you can see that in the agreements with Mercosur, with Canada, and the progress with India, Indonesia, Australia, etc. So a complicated geopolitical picture which informs, to answer your question, the diplomatic relationship between the EU and China at the present time.
Thanks, Declan. Noah, same general impressions, the roller coaster, could the roller coaster come off its tracks, for instance? And also this week, the European Commission found that China is helping Russia militarily. How big an issue, Declan has alluded to that, how big an issue is that for the relationship?
Well, I think, well, first of all, thanks for the invitation. Very good to be here. I think on the roller coaster, you know, as Alicia sort of mentioned, we've been on the downhill part of the roller coaster for some time. And we have had some perhaps moments of where the roller coaster has been going up, but there haven't been that many of them. And we are coming to a point, and we can get into this later, where I think the economic relationship is getting to the point where it's becoming very difficult for Europe to maintain its current policy, which has gone out of its way to be European EU leaders have gone out of their way to engage with China. They've been voicing their concerns about the economic relationship for years, and the feeling now is Beijing has not been listening to these concerns, and it's time to step up the measures, and we can get into that in more detail. On China training Russian troops for the fight in Ukraine, I think there was a Reuters report about a month ago that said that the training of roughly 200 Russian military personnel in China took place late last year. The focus of this training was on drone warfare. And the report said that some of these Russian soldiers had since returned to Ukraine. And I think the report also cited some documents suggesting that senior Russian and Chinese officers had signed some sort of agreement for mutual training about a year ago in Beijing. China's foreign ministry has denied this, but earlier this week, Kaja Kallas, the EU's top diplomat, appeared to confirm that these reports were true. Look, I don't think this is a game changer for the EU-China relationship, just because we've known since 2022 that China has been supporting the Russian war effort. In many ways, notably through the supply of dual-use technologies that have been used on the battlefield in Ukraine. Now, of course, the report, if it's true that China has actually been training Russian troops in China, that certainly adds a new dimension to this support. It's further evidence that China is not a neutral actor in this conflict, but as I said, we've known that for some time. I think the timing is interesting, coming just before this debate at EU level over imposing tougher trade measures on China. I think on the margins, it makes it more difficult for member states to make the case against a new approach. But I still think that it's the economic relationship which is really driving the debate right now. I think, the widening trade imbalances, the weaponization of dependencies, the deindustrialization that we're seeing in a country like Germany, where I am. So I would just conclude by saying it's the economy, stupid. This is what is driving the debate in Europe right now. And I think if the economic relationship was going gangbusters and China was supporting Russia, I don't think we'd be in the same place as we are now.
Thank you. And that's a perfect segue back to our professional economist, Alicia. The anti-coercion instrument was designed, the EU's anti-coercion instrument was designed largely with China in mind. Up until last year, kind of the conventional wisdom in Europe was that, at least economically, there were three big blocs in the world and we could go toe-to-toe with China and America. Now, I think that was severely undermined. That view was undermined last year with the Turnberry deal, where ultimately Europe folded because the US could harm us more than we could harm them. Do you think that's the same with China? Can they harm us more than we harm them? And is the anti-coercion instrument really not something that's ever going to be deployed?
Both the US and China can harm us more than we can harm them, by all means. But the reason is not only what appears I mean, what is so apparent to certainly to Chinese and Americans, and unfortunately also to Europeans, that we seem to have fallen behind in in innovation, in resources. If you think about the U.S. becoming a net exporter of oil, I mean, something that hasn't happened to Europe. If you look at the evolution of both the U.S. and China, I think we need to accept that Europe has not followed that path. But that is not the only reason why we have this asymmetric relation. The other reason is in our hands. And it's not about becoming more competitive. That will take time. No. It's about our instruments. So this brings me to kind of Freudian industrial accelerator about the anti-coercion instrument, but many others. We play a game first. We're basically starting the game 6-0. Yeah, for the reason I mentioned. No, but we play with tied feet, and the others don't tie them. That's what it is. And what I mean to say is that every instrument we design must be WTO compliant. Yeah, to start the conversation. We're the only ones. What about this 7th of April legislation in China, which was basically passed like at the speed of light on supply chain resilience? Is that WTO compliant? Has anybody even asked whether it is WTO compliant? So, we play defense, basically, and with tight feet. So being behind is an issue, but it's not the only issue. That's what I am trying to say. So if you're behind, you cannot play at a disadvantage that you yourself put on you. That's what we're doing, we Europeans. And this may sound, for any orthodox economist, something like, I've heard this so many times, where did you get your PhD? Okay, fine, I don't mind. Because it's not about that. It's the world has changed. Whoever did a PhD at my age, wherever you learned, basically today things are different, and that's basically the point. So, but we Europeans do not want to accept this, so we keep on playing the old game. Now, do we need to break the system? No, we don't need to break the system. We need to fake the system as everybody else does, and that doesn't mean saying we do not play the game, which it just means we don't say anything. But we do not stay behind, not only because of our own weaknesses, but for self-imposed reasons. Yeah. So ACI, let me give you the example. We designed this document, so-called, well, for some, I can tell you because we have these discussions at Bruegel, it was actually a response to the US. Whatever it was, China or the US, it doesn't really matter. What matters is we can't use it. That's what matters. And why? Because basically it's designed not to be used. As simple as that. And it's designed not to be used because everybody wanted to show something that looks like leverage, but that the Commission can't touch. Why? Because to put it in place, we need qualified majority. So good luck.
Just to pick you, to reiterate,
yes.
It's just incredible how the change in the economics profession on trade has been. Paul Krugman said recently in a podcast, "We're not in Kansas anymore," quoting the famous Wizard of Oz, that it's completely changed. And those, for many years, it was that belief that free trade is efficient, the market will sort it out. But now the security aspect and the weaponization of trade has caused the mainstream economics profession, certainly in the Western world, to completely change on its views. Declan, sorry, go ahead, Lucy.
Just to add and to finish, it's not that whatever we said about trade was false. It's that we Europeans cannot determine how trade is run. We're too small. That's the problem. We're not market makers here. That's why this doesn't work. It's not because trade is not efficient. It is if everybody plays the same game. But if they don't, the biggest players in the world, let alone India and many other global South economies, then you're on your own, playing as we say in Spanish, solitario. I don't know how you say that in English. You play yourself. Then you're not playing, are you? So that's the problem. I leave it there.
Declan, that's pretty depressing from a European perspective, pretty depressing point of view. I'd certainly share that view of Alicia's, that Europe is playing by the rules of a game that no longer exists. And I think we're particularly prone to that in Ireland, that international law is still, we have to abide by international law. It's more important than anything else. Are we making a mistake in that and saying, look, the system, the old world has changed. We need to change with it, or to protect our own interests?
Yeah. Very interesting question, Dan. Could I briefly comment on one part of your previous question to Alicia? Is this that the anti-coercion instrument was actually conceived as much as the US in mind as much as China, indeed probably more so, because I remember as permanent representative discussing with the Commission at senior level what became the anti-coercion instrument back towards the latter stages of Trump 1.0. And that was really the first Trump administration. And it was a series of challenges that were coming from the first Trump administration that were really driving this approach to the anti-coercion instrument. It was only enacted a couple of years later. And of course, its first potential use was in relation to a China-Lithuania issue. It was never used, never has been used. But I just think it's worth keeping in mind that the anti-coercion instrument was, erga omnes, and the omnes included the Trump administration, if I could put it like that. In relation to your question about international law, yeah, I think you've touched on a very important thing. I was quite impressed by what Mark Carney said recently in his speech, I think at Davos, that perhaps we should stop talking about the rules-based international order because of he saw ruptures. He kind of gave a historical account of it. Things have changed, and look, I think we probably have to, as European Union, to be honest, that if the EU is going to adopt some of the measures that are being talked about to defend itself, they are measures that mark a fairly substantial departure from traditional EU approach to international trade law and rules-based order. I mean, Maros Sefcovic has been honest enough to refer to this in the Financial Times recently when he said perhaps we need to look again at most favored nation. So if you mean by that the circumstances have changed, that international law actually should not simply be held up and put in a glass case and kind of worshipped, if you like, yes, international law, of course, has to evolve itself. So I think that the formula, the slogan, let's talk about the rules-based order, let's talk about international law, is one that more thought has to be given to as we go forward.
No, your thoughts on whether there'd ever be a qualified majority for the anti-coercion instrument, and maybe given Germany is the biggest economy in the EU, it certainly has the biggest trading relationship, economic relationship with China. Maybe talk us through some of the dynamic in the discussion between the coalition partners, between government and industry, on what position Germany should take vis-a-vis China.
Sure. I think on the anti-coercion instrument, I don't think if we did see China getting involved actively in Ukraine, if China responded to rather measured EU trade defense policies by shutting off all critical raw materials, rare earth magnets to Europe, I think you could certainly see a world where there is a qualified majority for the anti-coercion instrument. I think the problem with the ACI, as it's called, is that it's been presented as this sort of bazooka measure, and the bar has been very high to implementing it. I think the EU would be in a better place if member states sort of gave the Commission a green light to use some of the measures that are in the ACI without necessarily seeing this as a massive escalation, because there are a menu of options that the ACI gives Europe that I think could be helpful in terms of leverage. As far as Germany goes, I think we have two camps in the government. There's a realist camp that is looking at the numbers, the sharp decline in German exports to China, the crushing industrial competition coming out of China, the hundreds of thousands of German jobs that have been lost to this competition. And they are saying something needs to change. And I would put people in the foreign ministry in this camp. Then you have another camp represented by the economy ministry, and there are also some people in the chancellery who view it this way, which argue that Germany's economic problems are mainly down to high energy prices and cumbersome bureaucracy, that not China, that Germany is too dependent on China to risk a trade confrontation, that a shift to a more confrontational approach would cost Germany more than doing nothing, and also pushing back against any measures that might be seen as protectionist. So this goes back to the discussion we were having earlier about sort of how we viewed free trade these days. I think in the economy ministry we have sort of free trade Taliban, free trade fundamentalists, and to stick with the Wizard of Oz analogy, they are clicking their heels and repeating to themselves, "There's no place like home." So you have two camps in the government, you have two camps in German industry. Sectors like machine tools, chemicals, not to mention steel, wind, that are being crushed by Chinese competitors. They're calling for more protection from Brussels. You have Mittelstand companies, so small and medium-sized enterprises that used to make a lot of money exporting to China. Those exports are drying up because of competition against local rivals, import substitution policies. So that's one camp. The other camp is the camp that I think we're all familiar with, essentially a handful of large German companies led by the car makers who are really betting their future on China. They've invested heavily in China in recent years. They can produce more cheaply there. They can learn from Chinese partners who, certainly in terms of electric vehicle technologies and battery technologies, they are ahead of the Europeans and ahead of the Germans. They have their entire supply chain at their front doorstep. And if they had their druthers, they would like to produce in China and export to the rest of the world, including to Germany and to Europe. And of course, that has implications for jobs in Wolfsburg and Stuttgart and Munich. So this is not a clear-cut political decision for Friedrich Merz, the German chancellor. And I think that is why we've seen a degree of paralysis, a high degree of risk aversion from successive German governments when it comes to China. But I think the numbers are getting more and more difficult to ignore. And at the European Council meeting later today, that I think China will be on the menu at dinner. I think after weeks of really tortured discussions within the government in Berlin, I expect Merz to come out and support the Commission in developing new instruments. There are two instruments that are under discussion. One would be a sort of US Section 301 style tariff weapon, which would allow for much broader tariffs to be introduced. The other is a diversification instrument, which would compel companies to diversify their supply chains and critical inputs. I have my questions about how easy that will be to put in place. But I think, so there is German support for these measures, but these measures are going to take 1 to 2 years to put in place. So the question is, what does Germany support over the next couple of years until these new instruments are in place? And I think that is where the issue is, because the Commission, France, a number of other countries are pushing for the use of safeguards, which would allow the Commission to deploy tariffs along a much broader scope of sectors. And they're a blunt instrument. They hit all trading partners. There are ways to carve out trading partners and focus them on China. But I don't think Germany is on board for these short-term measures. So that is, I think, where the big where the divisions are going to be over the coming months. There is a German expression, lieber ein Ende mit Schrecken als ein Schrecken ohne Ende, which basically means better an end with horror than a horror without end. And I think that is the debate that Germany is having. Do we go confrontational and accept that we're going to have serious blowback, or do we continue to muddle through and it's just, we have a horror without end? So I think it's not easy choices for the German government.
Okay, this conversation is certainly not cheering me up. Alicia, in terms of the differences amongst the member states, I think it'd be fair to say that your home country, Spain, is probably at the sort of one end of the spectrum in terms of being, if not pro-China, then certainly being against punitive measures. Maybe at the other extreme, France, which has always been sort of more security focused and protectionist. Just maybe talk us a little through how the dynamics in Spain are, and more generally how you see the divisions amongst the member states, and maybe then it'll come to Declan in terms of how does China exploit them. All countries, I suppose, in dealings with the EU do try and exploit divisions within the EU. But maybe we'd come to that issue. But Alicia, first on Spain and the spectrum of opinion in the EU.
Well, if we look at the past, that is the decision on electric vehicle tariffs on electric vehicles, Germany opposed and Spain abstained. So that was the order at the time, and we had Orban to make to basically get the extreme. Nobody could compete with Orban on that extreme. But I would say that when it came to economic issues, Germany was quite on a side. So I think what's happening now here in NOAA and conversations I have with German friends and colleagues, I think Germany is moving not necessarily where France is, but it's moving away from that very strong pro-market only position. I think this was Scholz's position. It seems to me Merz is kind of not very sure where he is, to be frank, but certainly not where Scholz was. That's my take, and I'm happy to hear Nora's views. But you're asking about Spain. So what happened to Spain is that Spain was kind of slightly closer to France compared to Germany when we think about these tariffs. Then we got some retaliation. I even wrote a piece on the pork case and what it meant. But it's not only about that. It's that Spain has received a lot of investment, a lot of promises of investment. Some get decimated as we speak. I think SAIC promised, not a big deal, 200 million, and it seems it's going to be half. I mean, they're not like massive investments. The US is so many more times bigger. I checked the numbers, and the whole Chinese investment is not even a tenth. So it's not really so important, to be frank. But I think it just means that because it's new, and these are new sectors where Spain has this expectation, right or wrongly, probably wrongly to me, that they will get tech transfer, that they will, kind of be they will have a first mover advantage, if you want, within Europe. I mean, that's kind of the idea. I think that's where their position started to lean further away, even more than Germany, into the direction, and this was the direction of not accepting such measures. And this is not only my impression, but I guess this is confirmed, or at least supported, I wouldn't say confirmed, by the fact that Spain was in these 5 member states supporting the non-paper with China-related actions, and then moved away from that non-paper immediately after. Which to me, just my sense, it means probably, again, just my sense, the opinions are not the same, and you may have, prime minister opinions versus maybe other ministries, maybe the Ministry of Economy, I feel like what's happening I would say Scholz's case was adamant, no one can add, but in my view, the Chancellery then was kind of extremely pro-China compared to, say, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In our case, just my take is mostly about, okay, the economic rationale of this all, okay, it's appealing, but it's not maybe as convincing. But then you have the political and the foreign affairs kind of vision of the world, which if you want to hear what it is, just read the speech, Sanchez's speech at Tsinghua, to get a feeling of what that means. Is this power of the global south? The world is changing, the power is shifting, but we're Europeans. That's my response to that speech. I leave it there.
Thanks, Declan. We've only got a few minutes left. So an Ireland-specific question. Where do you see Ireland on that spectrum amongst the member states in terms of its position towards China, the hawkish or the dovish end, and how has it evolved over time?
I think Ireland is firmly in the mainstream, in the centre of the pack. And on trade issues, the default position of Ireland, and this goes back decades across very many issues, is to essentially support the Commission unless there is an overwhelming reason not to. So essentially mainstream and basically go with the flow, what the Commission proposes. Again, barring some compelling reason not to. That's short answer to your question. But
let me push you a little further, just in terms of, when you left Beijing, 2013, it was, relations were pretty good, and it was what's being called the hide your power, bide your time. And that sort of changed towards the end of the 2010s, and there was this wolf warrior type diplomacy. Certainly the last time I was in China, maybe 8-9 years ago, I had an extraordinary meeting with somebody, and I got lectured just out of the blue in a way I'd never been lectured before, in a sort of aggressive way. And I wonder, what was the end of the hide and bide and the more aggressive posture? Have you seen that, and have you seen any change in the Irish position with that more aggressive posture?
No, first of all, hide and bide is a slogan. It's a slogan, goes back to Deng Xiaoping, and it's a slogan. And I'm always a little suspicious of slogans. Secondly, hide and bide, in the way you've described it, had long disappeared. Certainly before I left Beijing, and Xi Jinping was General Secretary. Had been General Secretary for about a year when I left. But hide and bide had gone about 5 years before. And if I were to look at watersheds, which really, if you like, kind of ended hide and bide decisively, one was psychological. It was the Olympics, the success of the Summer Olympics. And that gave quite a psychological boost, both because of the successful holding of the Olympics, also because of the huge harvesting of gold medals to China. And that was noticeable. And the second one was the perception, the growing perception in the Chinese leadership and officialdom that the West had feet of clay because of the financial crisis, which was also 2008. And I think if I were to look at visible watersheds, they would be two. But even before that, hide and bide was nothing more than a slogan. Certainly, there was no sort of modesty or false modesty in terms of projecting Chinese interests, and in terms of some very important core national interests, hide and bide has never applied. I think, in particular, in relation to something like Taiwan.
I would love to go into that topic further with both Noah and Alicia, but unfortunately, we've hit the 45-minute mark. Maybe one to come back to another time. Could I thank all three of you for your really informative and insightful contributions? Thank our audience for watching, and this will be available as a podcast shortly on the IIEA website. So good afternoon to everyone, and thanks again.